pleasure to be here. It's a very cool environment, I must say. No, don't be cool. I mean, cool isn't good. The moral argument is an argument for God's existence from the phenomena of moral facts. It comes in a variety of forms, some of which are more persuasive than others, some of which are patently unpersuasive. But it trades on the idea that moral facts, as facts, have no place in a universe if God doesn't exist. In what I think is probably the most simple form, it looks like this. It's premise one: if God did not exist, then there could not be any moral facts. Number two, there are moral facts. Three, therefore God exists. Now it's logically valid in that the conclusion does follow from the premises, but it's not all that persuasive. The claims being made are quite deniable. Especially premise one, it's obviously very contentious. You could simply reject that and therefore reject the argument. Or premise two, although it's less common to reject premise two, a number of philosophers and thinkers do. They say, well, there are no moral facts, and so I reject the argument. I think that the argument can be made a lot more plausible in an extended form, which is a bit more nuanced, as follows. Premise one: if there are moral facts, so it doesn't say there are any moral facts, just as if there are any moral facts, then their basis is either natural or supernatural, and that's supposed to be construed in such a way, natural or non-natural, so that it's mutually exclusive, it includes all possible options. Number two, the basis of moral facts is not natural. Three, therefore, if there are moral facts, then their basis is supernatural. Four, the most plausible way to think of a supernatural basis of moral facts is in terms of a supernatural person who brings moral facts about, and then the conclusion. Therefore, if there are moral facts, then the most plausible way to think of their basis is in terms of a supernatural person who brings moral facts about. Now, obviously, some of these claims are more contentious than others. If you look at, say, premise 3 and 5, the ones that begin with therefore, well, those are really just the logical conclusions of the premises that came before, so those aren't the contentious ones. I think all the attention really focuses on premises 2 and 4, where we claim that the basis of moral facts is not, in fact cannot, be natural, and premise 4, the most plausible way to think of a supernatural basis of moral facts is in terms of a supernatural person. And those, I think, are the ones that are likely to get to attract the most critical attention. And I think that, as a matter of fact, those two claims can be defended reasonably well. So let's start with the claim that the basis of moral facts is not natural, because that's the first one that's going to be criticised, I think. It's a bone of contention because a large number of atheists consider themselves moral. In fact, I would say most atheists, like most people, consider themselves moral, and they also recognise a lot of things in the world around them as either moral or immoral. Charity, most of us would regard as morally good. Rescuing prisoners of war, well, that's morally good. The pursuit of justice, love, and so on, these are all things that are morally good in some sense. Most atheists also believe that some things are morally wrong, as a matter of fact. Child molestation, torturing people just for the fun of it, being excessively greedy. When people in general, whether they're atheist or not, see these things, we don't just think, at least we don't instinctively just think, well, that's not really in keeping with my personal norms or the norms of my culture. We tend to see these things as acts which ought not to be done. No matter what culture you come from, there is something fundamentally wrong with, say, torturing people to death just because you like hearing them scream. And given that atheists in general believe this, they're hesitant, quite understandably, to believe that moral facts couldn't be natural. Because a thoroughgoingly atheistic outlook on life, I think, is best construed as thoroughly naturalistic. And there's nothing other than the natural world, as Carl Sagan put it, the universe is all there is, all there ever has been, and all there ever will be. And so it seems enormously counterintuitive to I'd say, to most people, to just think, no, there are no moral facts. And if you're an atheist, that puts you in a position of saying, well, what kind of facts are we dealing with here? They have to be natural. But the moral argument really forces us to ask, could moral facts just be natural facts about the universe? Now, could they be brute facts of nature, like the fact that there's a chair sitting over there, or the fact that trees grow, or the sky is blue, or what have you? Are moral facts like that? I know that a number of atheists have tried to argue that moral facts are just natural facts with no need of any kind of lawgiver, but I don't see that they've been very successful. And at any rate, those attempts are contentious. The reason is that moral facts don't have to do with the way things are. Moral facts really have to do with the way that things should be. They're not really descriptive. They're not saying this is the way the world is. They're prescriptive. As I say, this is the way that the world should be. This is the way that we should live. Natural facts, on the other hand, are just facts about what is. So they seem to be quite different in nature. Things just are this way. But if natural facts are the only kind of facts, then the same is true of human beings, surely. People maim and torture each other. They rape, exploit, and terrorize each other. And that's just the way things are. It's a true description of reality. But there's nothing in here to connect to a prescription about the way things ought to be. There are different kinds of facts, in other words. And so I think it's very plausible to maintain that the basis of moral facts is not natural, because natural facts aren't moral in nature, they're merely descriptive. Well, what then of the fourth premise? And this is perhaps more contentious still for some people. The most plausible way to think of a supernatural or non-natural basis of moral facts is in terms of a supernatural person who brings moral facts about. Well, if we've got to think of morality as having its basis in something that's not part of nature, how should we think of it? Now, there is more than one way of construing a non-natural basis of morality. The philosopher Plato and all those who identify with this thought, or with Platonism, have this idea that there is this impersonal form of the good. It's this ideal idea that just exists in reality but not in nature. It's this non-natural thing that's out there. And to the extent that things in the world resemble the good, they are, in fact, morally good. I find that to be an idea that doesn't get us very far. I mean, you've heard the supposedly mysterious question in Zen, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Well, the idea of Platonic forms, I think, is even more mysterious still. They're like conscious thoughts that exist, even if there is no one who thinks them. Just thoughts without a thinker, which doesn't really strike me as a sensible idea. What's more, the free-floating, non-natural and non-personal thing called goodness surely isn't the kind of things that could have intentions. And it is this intentional or normative aspect of morality that makes it what it is, namely a set of prescriptive duties. By performing duties, it seems as though you're responding to some intentions about the way that things should be, which is not the kind of property that an impersonal, non-natural thing can have. The only kind of things that can have intentions are persons. So this leaves us with what I think is actually a sound argument, and therefore a true conclusion. If there are moral facts, then the most plausible way to think of their basis is in terms of a supernatural person who brings moral facts about. So there's the basic argument. But it's important to bear several things in mind. In fact, I have 4 things that are important because it's easy to miss them when you first encounter the moral argument. Firstly, the moral argument as I've given it here doesn't prove that God exists. Not even for a moment. God's existence is not in the conclusion. What it establishes is contingent. It's if there are moral facts, then they are best explained by a supernatural person who's the source of moral truth. But I think that the existence of a being like that is not compatible with philosophical naturalism, which is the view that the universe is all that is, matter, energy, and nothing else. So what we have is a contingent claim. If there are moral facts, then there's something like God. Notice, secondly, that this argument has a further logical consequence. If no supernatural person exists, then there are no moral facts. And I think that is the real kicker here on a psychological level. And I think this is why a number of atheists are, on an emotive rather than necessarily on a rational level, so strongly opposed to the moral argument for theism. It effectively says to them something that is potentially offensive. It says to them that they are denying that moral claims are true. And who wants to be in that position? Not many people. The thought that your position results in the enormously counterintuitive and rather shocking claim that raping and torturing young girls for your own pleasure isn't in fact morally wrong is a pretty bitter pill to swallow. You might think that I'm intentionally using, kind of emotive examples here. Well, of course I am, and in a way that's the point. The example is emotive only because it evokes in us the involuntary response of moral shock. That's incredibly wrong. That's why it's emotive. It seems screamingly obvious to atheists, as it does to the rest of us, that such acts are utterly wicked. And the thought that an atheist is taking away our basis for saying so is therefore psychologically unbearable. Hence the emotive rather than rational resistance to the moral argument. Third, the moral argument for theism is not tied to any one idiosyncratic version of theism. It would be pointless to say, for example, as some have said, but that doesn't prove that Christianity is true. Well, that's correct, it doesn't. It doesn't mean to prove that Christianity is true. That's why the truth of Christianity is not mentioned anywhere in any of the premises or the conclusion. It would also be pointless to reply to the argument by saying to a Jew or to a Christian, well, look at what your nasty God did in the Old Testament of the Bible. He required harsh and unreasonable criminal punishment and acts of war against entire innocent civilizations. Those things are clearly morally deficient. Well, even if that's true, that's not relevant to this version of the moral argument. If we were, just for argument's sake, all to agree that the God of the Old Testament did some pretty shady things, then we'd still have to conclude that atheism is false. And that's the point of the argument. It's not an argument for the reliability or the moral virtue of the Bible, although in a different context I'd have some things to say about that. The further problem here is, of course, that if the moral argument is sound, then the atheist is in a bit of a bind if he retaliates by making moral judgments about the Old Testament, since if atheism is true, then there just aren't any moral facts to appeal to when complaining about the Old Testament. Lastly, and possibly most importantly, the moral argument is about the basis of moral facts. It's about what makes them factually true. It's not about what makes the facts knowable. Here's a useful analogy. Newton's theorization about gravity tells us about what makes gravity do the things that it does. But that doesn't mean that unless we believe Newton, then we can't know that things fall down. Obviously we can. I mean, 3,000 years ago, people knew that if you let something go, it fell down. You didn't have to know the theoretical facts about gravity before you knew that. Of course we can. People knew that a long time ago. But similarly, the moral argument tells us that God makes moral facts what they are, but that doesn't mean, and should never be construed to mean, that people who don't believe in God cannot know right from wrong, or that they can't be moral people. Sometimes when I hear the moral argument presented, the objection is, but I know lots of good atheists. I'm sure you do, and you probably are one. That's not the point. Of course you can be moral. In fact, the biblical writers make it clear that they believed that the moral law, the moral facts, were written on the human conscience and revealed imperfectly through the conscience of humankind. So nobody here is saying that atheists are thoroughly wicked people, or that they're any less moral than religious people. Of course they're not. They can and they do perform acts of great moral value. What they cannot do, however, if the moral argument is sound, is offer a truthful explanation of what makes those actions morally praiseworthy without abandoning atheism altogether. So bearing those four important caveats in mind, the moral argument leaves us with two options. Either we should accept that God exists and begin the all-important task of searching for him earnestly in light of the importance that God's existence has, or we should give up belief in moral facts and say that we live in a world where there is no moral difference at all between the things that the world calls acts of virtue and the things that we call atrocities. In short, whatever else might exist in a godless world, and that's a subject for a whole other discussion, moral facts certainly could not exist. And so that is the sum total of the moral argument or the version that I'm presenting to you. Any discussion, comments, criticisms are more than welcome.